It's a question every single brand should really sit down and try and answer. If your brand is the answer, what is the question? If I look at Walmart, I could say with certainty they'd all say value. If it were Amazon, it would be, as you said, convenience. If it was a company like Patagonia, environmental protectionism. They understand themselves perfectly. When you have that sense of course heading, things are much, much easier to deal with.
So one of the things in getting ready for this this discussion is like everybody wants a crystal ball, like what's going to happen, what's going to change, and all that. And as a futurist, maybe one kind of describe what that is. I'm not sure everybody really understands what that is, and how do you think about predicting the future in a way that can create value for our listeners' businesses as well as them personally and their families.
So, yeah, I mean, the genesis of my business was really the realization after about 25 years in business that industries tend to be incredibly short-sighted, and certainly the retail industry is no different. In fact, one might even argue that because of the nature of retail, that it is literally, the old practice of counting what goes in the till each day, it may even be more nearsighted than other industries. And so I really felt when I started the company in 2008, 2009, given everything that was happening at that point, collapse of the economic system and the banking system, massive changes in technology, a demographic shift that was taking place, and of course the media landscape was blowing up, I really felt there was this tremendous need for a longer horizon, someone that was kind of looking out on a much longer horizon and trying to synthesize the changes that were happening across society and then bring those back to executives in an embraceable way. And I think that, to your question, I think the one thing maybe that I've recognized more than anything is that you really cannot project the future of an industry by staring at the industry itself. It's in the same way that you can't sort of become an artist by going to museums and looking at art. Artistry is a whole bunch of different inputs that someone takes through their life experience, and then they project that onto the canvas or onto the tape in the case of music, or the stage if it's a play. So in the same way, I look at futurism as really being sort of an antenna that is pointed out to the universe. And at all times, you're trying as much as possible to take in information across all kinds of different verticals from all parts of humanity, and then trying to synthesize that into something that has meaning for a particular industry, for a particular category, or for a particular business. So at any given point in time, I'm looking at what's happening in media. I'm looking at what's happening politically and geopolitically. I'm trying to understand how the entertainment landscape is changing, or even how perhaps people are eating differently than they might have 10 years ago. And then trying as much as possible to put that all together into some sort of contextual message for business leaders.
Yeah, it's a big thing to really think about. When I look at the future and I'm predicting different businesses that I'm part of and what's going to happen in different communities that I'm part of, the only thing, and I don't consider myself to be a futurist at all, but the only thing I can really count on is just human nature drivers. I don't think that changes. But there's a lot of things that change in terms of tools that are available, the political landscape, everything else that goes with it. And I did read Resurrecting Retail, the Future of Business in a Post-Pandemic World, getting ready for this discussion. And you talk about a couple of things in there, the all or nothing trap when kind of thinking about where things are going, presenteeism effect, myth of black swans. So maybe if you could just elaborate on a couple of the traps that we fall into when we're thinking about the future and making the right decisions today to get ready for it.
And to your point, it's a good one. I think certainly human needs tend not to change, right? The very, very base fundamental needs, our need for security, our need for love, our need for self-esteem and recognition. I mean, a lot of those fundamental human needs remain intact. What changes is how we express them. And also, you can't discount the external environment and how it plays on those needs, whether that's the economic landscape or the geopolitical context. But fundamentally, humans are humans, right? And we remain fundamentally locked into that need set. In terms of that notion that oftentimes we tend to think of change in absolute terms, especially within a business. And this was very prevalent. I remember, if I go back, to 2009, 2010, having conversations around e-commerce. And you have to remember, in 2009, Amazon was, was kind of looked at as being a bit of a joke, frankly. It was a company that, they had revenue, but they had zero profit. They were losing money year after year after year. And so you had this glibness among physical retailers, where they were sort of saying, we've got that in our rearview mirror, but it's not much of a concern. Um, the point that many miss is that Amazon doesn't all of a sudden have to take all the business in order to become a serious threat. If they in retail, if you lose 20% of your revenue, that in many cases is enough to put the lights out. It doesn't have to be losing the majority of your business in order for it to become fatal. And this is the case with most things, that a minority change can spark a majority outcome, you know? And so I try and impress upon leaders that you really have to start looking for the earliest signs of change, as opposed to just looking at what's happening in your industry, because what you're seeing is the manifestation of change that may have been sparked months or years ago, and you're just seeing the tail end reaction to it. You really have to get way out in front of that and understand what is instigating that trend in the first place, and be proactive in building strategy to address it.
Yeah, it all makes sense. And what's happening today? So a new CEO can come into a company in 2 months. People can say, "Oh, this isn't going well," or "This is going well," and yet that's a product of what was going on in some cases up to 10 years earlier, leading up to it. One of the things that I really wanted to ask you this question, so here it is. Like, how do we develop better filters in a world where I've gotten to a place where I literally don't believe anything at first pass anymore because of
Hmm.
all conflicts of interest out there and the psychological nudging that's going on. How do we develop better filters so we don't let, and I call it weaponizing false morality. We don't let people play us that way, whether it's businesses, government, family, friends, whatever that happens to be. And so I spent a lot of time on, what are the right filters and how to think about things and get to the source of truth. Does that question make sense? Like, how do we develop that so we can better predict the future to create value more effectively for ourselves and our families and businesses?
Yeah, the information ecosystem right now, it's something I talk a lot about in the latest book that I wrote. The information ecosystem right now is a huge problem, not just for business, but for society. And y- there's so much information out there that is designed either purely as clickbait, that there's some tremendous revelatory study that's been done that makes this bold sort of prediction, or this bold declaration, and then when you scratch through the veneer, you find out that the sample size was virtually insignificant, that it was, that the polling method itself was completely erroneous and outdated. And we see this kind of information all the time, and it's designed really just to generate revenue. We also, see information in the ecosystem that is really designed to create outrage. And we've seen this. Facebook and Meta are in court right now to try and defend themselves against accusations of literally weaponizing their platforms to become addictive and knowingly harmful to young people. But um, the whole information ecosystem is something that has become tremendously tainted, and it should really be looked at with a very jaundiced eye. So, in the course of doing what I do, I am constantly reconfirming, corroborating information, going to a different source to try and find out if what I'm looking at is credible, is it true, can I confidently use that information to sort of guide my thinking, and in many cases, you find out that it really isn't information that you can trust. So certainly, the days where we could sort of look at kind of the trusted sources of information in the landscape, the touchstones that we would always go to, those days are gone. There's tons of information out there, and it's very difficult to know what you can and cannot trust.
Yeah, yeah, it's challenging. When I was a kid, so I'll be 65 this year. So growing up late 60s, early 70s, I remember as an example of this thing that we're talking about right now, government had really high trust. I would say in the 80% range. And today, I think it's less than 10, 15%.
Mm.
And with whatever is going on, it's like, how do we develop, these filters to figure out what is the source of truth? For example, early on for me in COVID, I mean, that was devastating for so many businesses. And I work with a lot of different companies, CEOs. I've invested in a lot of different things. It's like some thrived and some they got buried, going through it. But I'm listening to the government and they're saying things that they can't know to be true and know aren't true. So instantly, that's like an example of a filter for me.
Mhm.
uh, you can't say something like, for example, you can never, catch COVID or give it to anybody if you take a vaccine. Well, you can't know that yet because we're just putting it out. Or safe and effective when there's already dozens of safety signals coming in, most notably, heart issues. So with that going on, like how do we restore trust and with government, like, what are your recommendations around that? But also with companies that are doing the same kinds of things just to generate revenue. For those that really want to create value in the world and not take value out of the world, uh, it's kind of a big question I'm asking right now. But how do we find sources of truth and develop trust? So if I'm running a company and I want super high trust because we're doing all the right things and creating intentional value, how should we
Mhm.
think about that and reestablishing trust without playing games?
Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that trust is, and I position it this way in this book, that trust is, to my mind, one of the most powerful competitive advantages that a country or a company can possess. And as an example in the book, I look at Berkshire Hathaway as an example of a company that operated with the highest conceivable level of integrity. They weren't perfect. No, nobody's perfect. But I would argue that Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway were about as close as you could come to being perfect in terms of managing their integrity. Warren Buffett even said, I mean, every year he published a letter and sent it out to his management across all of the companies that Berkshire owned, and basically the message was, lose money and I'll forgive you. Lose an ounce of brand reputation or integrity for this company and you're gone. And I actually witnessed that firsthand with one of the companies that I was working with, that Warren Buffett himself got on a plane and escorted a CEO out of the building because of a financial impropriety within the company. So, but what Buffett understands is that trust lowers the cost of capital. Trust actually creates an investor premium. Investors are willing to pay more for your stock and they're willing to forgive your missteps if they trust you. That trust gives you better consumer retention, so better employee performance. Across the board, trust is an incredibly powerful form of capital. And I would argue that the same is true of countries. And we're seeing that play out right now. I would argue that many countries across the world today do not trust the United States the way they might have 5 years ago. And that is simply because when you create deals and you renege on deals and you change your mind every other day about the penalty that you're going to inflict on a country or on a group of countries, uh, those countries are going to operate with less trust. And so there's a penalty to be paid for that, right? We're seeing that right now in terms of the valuation of the US dollar and to an extent, the premium that now has to be awarded on government bonds. So trust is a powerful competitive advantage if you can harness it. I think in order for us to rebuild trust in business and in government, we have to understand where it all came untethered. If we look at, and this is why I also say that, if you really want to understand the future, pick up a history book. It's a great place to start. Some of the most prescient futurists that I know are also very astute historians. They understand not just where we're headed, but where we've come from. And so if we look back across time, the most prosperous time in North America for both Canadian consumers and American consumers was the period between 1945 and 1975. So, what was different during that time? Well, obviously, we just come out of a Second World War, but there was a tremendous bet. It was a bipartisan bet that was made on society. And that bet was basically this, that if we provide people with opportunities, if we provide people with a sense of security, if we make markets fundamentally more fair for the average person, that they can feel like they have a stake in the future and a stake in the economy, that if we invest in things like education and give people a sense of social and economic mobility, that they will be more productive, happier, and contribute more back to the economy. And that was essentially the thesis. And it worked. And it worked for about 35 years. Along comes 1980, when all of that sort of turns around, when Milton Friedman and a group of neoliberal economists called the Chicago School of Economics basically posit the idea that they had it completely wrong between 1945 and 1975. It's not about pushing the economy toward the middle class. It's really about lowering taxes, lowering regulation, and allowing corporations to make as much money as they possibly can. And the whole idea of 100% fealty to shareholders, that shareholder primacy was really the only obligation of the corporation, that it was about delivering returns to shareholders. From that point forward, what we see a collaboration between government. It was a very bipartisan collaboration between government and business, whereby we began to now chip away at the trust that had sort of built through that period of time, at the economic fairness that had been constructed during that time. And a lot of those investments in education began to wane as well. And so, what does that do? Ultimately, we lose trust when we feel that the system is set up against us, when no matter how hard we work or no matter how hard we try, we're not going to be able to get ahead, when we feel like there's an imbalance between the worker and the shareholder, that no matter how hard workers work, the spoils always go to shareholders. And when we lose that sense of fairness, that's the point at which we lose faith in democracy. And when we lose faith in democracy, we begin to look around for alternatives. And when someone comes along and says, I'll solve all your problems, I understand why the system is rigged, I'll go after the people that rigged it against you, I'll make it all right, and I'll do it, on my first day in office, we will go in that direction because we have no other hope. And so that brings us to where we are today. We are literally sitting, not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world today. We are sitting at the precipice of the decline of democracy, which is just an astonishing thing to say, but it's actually manifesting itself in the data. It's actually 65% of Americans in the last survey have very little faith that democracy is the way to go, which is just staggering. So it opens the door to all kinds of horrors, and I think that is precisely what we are seeing today.
And that's interesting. So obviously in the United States, for example, we're a constitutional republic. We're not a pure democracy. We're not. And I've never lost faith in that. I lost faith in a lot of leaders that are not acting appropriately. And I think the biggest deficit on the planet is having enough leaders that are both capable and moral and capable of doing the thing that they should be able to create the value essentially that their role is designed to create. And they're going to make decisions that are win-win, not win-lose for their benefit or their friends, benefits going through. So I feel like that really is the bigger challenge because I believe we as leaders create the environment from which everybody creates value within our families, within communities, within our companies. And you can take that to our, the various countries and what are the rules of engagement. And I find it super fascinating that we get caught up in something around solving a problem, but it's not really solving the problem. And real quick, I work with a lot of young kids in high school around the virtues of entrepreneurship, starting a business, and all of that. And part of what I talk about is why voting is important because our elected officials create the environment from which they're going to be operating their businesses in. Do you want headwinds or do you want tailwinds? And I ask, well, what's more important when you vote, personality or policy? And interestingly, over half the kids say personality. And by the end of the discussion, it's all policy. So one simple example of what I mean here, one person could be killed, unfortunately, and there could be billions of dollars in damage from rioting and everything else. And there could be policy that in the United States last year, for example, we cut the murder rate by 20%. Incredible. So that equates to over 4,000 people that weren't, there wasn't a homicide. They're alive. That was a way bigger impact. If the problem we're solving is that people aren't, killed unnecessarily. Well, look what happened there. Look at what happened with drug overdoses dropping significantly and all of it. Wow, there's a lot of folks that are walking around and yet will weaponize false morality, get people, ginned up, basically monetize division around one person where what's the problem we're solving for? So it's figuring all of that out and how to think through it. I'm not sure if you got much out of there. You can comment on what I said, but I always
Well,
look at the bigger picture. What are we
yeah,
solving for? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, look, it's a very complex problem, but I mean, if you go to the heart of it, whether we're talking about a constitutional republic or a pure democracy, and there are very few pure democracies around, but in the U.S. system, if the idea is that the average person's vote matters, it's very difficult to reconcile that against a backdrop where one individual can donate $280 million to one campaign, or one corporation can make that kind of donation, or a super PAC can make that kind of donation. That immediately leaves the average voter with the impression that their vote doesn't matter at all. What matters is who can write the biggest check. And whatever the demands of that individual are, whether that's, Amazon cutting a $40 million check for a movie, or whether that's Elon Musk cutting a $280 million check so that he can form Doge and go through the personal and financial and health records of every single American, that immediately puts the whole system off its axis. The whole idea that every individual comes to the table with the same power to elect a representative who will then go to Congress and will represent the needs and concerns of their constituents. I mean, this is so far from what the framers ever imagined, that someone would come along and basically buy an administration with one check. So I think that in itself, the whole Citizens United, the money in politics today is sort of a cancer that has to be at some point addressed if we're ever to get back to a point where things make sense. I think the other thing that is a problem, and it sort of plays into the idea of political power as well. It's the mutation of capitalism. We operate with this myth, this illusion of competition in not just the U.S. market. I would argue the Canadian market is the same. I would argue maybe even the Canadian market is worse. This myth of competition, that companies are out there every day trying to innovate and trying to create new ideas and new forms of value so that they can compete with one another, and it's complete nonsense. When we look at most major categories in the United States, everything from food production through to grocery retail to banking to air transport to you name it, they're oligopolies that are controlled by usually 2 to 3 companies in any one category. So the idea that we have, this free market where any good idea can come to the surface, that may have been true in 1975. It is not true today because, frankly, most of the largest companies in America are the ones that are buying those good ideas when they percolate. And in some cases, they're just killing them. They're shelving the patents that are associated with them. They're putting in any innovations that might have been disruptive, they're putting in a closet somewhere. They never see the light of day, and they're just going back to printing money. And they're certainly not disrupting themselves with innovation. And the larger these companies get, and this is where it connects back to politics, is they become ungovernable. That is a problem. When Google owns 90% of search, that is a problem in the market because Google becomes so large, they become ungovernable. And so we really are, I think, if we want to address some of these issues, it is not going to take a tweak. It's not going to take an individual that we have faith in. It's going to take a wholesale rewriting of everything, including the Constitution, because I think if Donald Trump has done anything, he has shown the world where all the holes in the Constitution of the United States are. He's done an incredible job of sort of picking through each of the vulnerabilities and exploiting those vulnerabilities, creating a roadmap, if anything, for how the Constitution needs to be amended in order to close some of those loopholes. So that, in conjunction with taking the money out of politics and breaking up monopolies. Now, I know, here I am. I'm the retail guy, right? I'm supposed to be the guy that's telling the industry how to make money.
You're
What
you're hel
I'm
you're
interested in,
you're helping companies be more effective monopolies, and I'm gonna show you how to do it, but it's not I'm kidding, to totally get there.
what I'm interested in is a free and fair market,
Yeah.
because I am truly interested in getting back to a place where an apple can come out of somebody's garage somewhere. I'm interested in getting back to a place where a company like Nike can truly be started by one individual. We are so far from that marketplace right now. I feel that all we do now is we've basically set up toll booths in the consumer's life. Every day I pay my toll to Google, I pay my toll to Kroger, I pay my toll to Amazon, you know, but there really and truly is no competitive, innovative, dynamic marketplace. And I'll tell you, that not only makes individual corporations vulnerable, and we saw this recently with Google. Google got caught behind the 8 ball by AI. They Google basically wrote the paper that OpenAI was created on. They wrote the code. But they were caught unawares because when you're that big, you become slow moving. But it also makes the whole country vulnerable. The Chinese marketplace is set up in a way that if they decide they're going to pursue something, the Chinese government will unleash hundreds of companies on an opportunity, and it will deliberately have those companies fight it out in an extremely, in like a blood sport kind of way, to determine who the best company ultimately is, and then they will pour their resources into that company. In the North American market, and to some extent the European market, we do the opposite. We defend monopolies. Government gives monopolies a free ride so that we're actually discouraging competition in our markets. And I think that makes the whole country and an entire economy vulnerable.
At scale, I agree with you. And I love the concept in your book, apex retailers, predators, if you will.
Mhm.
And then I think a lot of government agencies get captured by it as part of their strategy to infiltrate and make sure that policy laws are written to reinforce a monopoly. But there's levels of this. I think about my aerospace company. We were doing business in 60 countries. This is a nice, solid middle market, business. Couple thousand customers, and I had thousands of competitors. And so we're all trying to create more value for operators so they could meet their mission readiness and safety goals and all of that at a lowering cost over time. It was fierce. So I think as you kind of come down and it's supporting the behemoths, the biggest airlines in the world, et cetera, helicopter operators in the industry that I was in, there's a lot of competition kind of feeding up. And there are opportunities for things to come out, but if the apex retailers, these predators, have their way, they will block it everywhere. In fact, I to your point, I was part of starting two different industry organizations to lobby with the FAA and Congress to make sure that the Boeings of the world, the GEs, and all that wouldn't continually write rules that would keep everybody out of the game except for what they wanted to do. So
Exactly.
it's a constant battle. I don't see it really ever changing. I just want to be, you've heard the term before, an happy warrior, kind of plowing through that and
Yeah.
fight
Yeah.
for. I wish we called it, Doug, I wish we called it value creationism and not capitalism. Like everything's about net positive value that we can keep going forever. But when we
Right.
make win, lose, and rig the game, losers won't hang out very long and it creates the
Right.
chaos that we see today.
I mean, side note, the word capitalism was actually coined by a socialist named Louis Leblanc, a Frenchman, who used it as an aspersion. Capitalism was not, we sort of wear it as a badge of honor these days. I'm a capitalist, but he looked at it as being, the hoarding of capital by one party at the expense of another. And I think to his point, his definition is playing out today to an extent that maybe even he couldn't have imagined. But I think you hit on something really important, and that is, there's a lot of ambivalence, I think, around corporate leadership today, within corporate leadership today, around where should or should we not become politically active. Where should we, when should we be sticking to our knitting versus when should we actually stand up and become active in the political arena? And you mentioned fair rules of play, and I think that is really what should be the primary motivator today. I think that every company, and this is really the invocation that I make in the book, is that I believe it is down to business. I mean, individual citizens can only do so much, right? They can only take to the streets so many times. They can only protest so much. But it's ultimately going to come down to business leaders with a moral compass and an understanding that if they don't act, the rules of play become so distorted that they don't have a hope of competing. And that certainly is not going to be the largest retailers at the table or the largest businesses in the marketplace that come to that conclusion. I think it's going to be all the mid-sized players that aren't getting the kind of preferential treatment that the guys with deeper pockets have. So it's going to be a matter of mid-sized businesses coming together as a coalition to simply say that we're not going to tolerate this anymore.
Yeah, and I think consumers are going to push for the same thing. I think about the power of community, and you talked about that. I've heard you on podcasts talking about it. The book that I read, getting ready for this, and they're losing trust. They want something different, and maybe from there is where things will rise and be different. Like the new Apple's coming up and all of it. And when I think about the experience, you talk about experience retail. It's everything you said in the book is perfect for just about every single business, really. How do we connect with the community? How do we leverage a trusted relationship network and grow all of it? You talked about being super intentional, make sure you sweat the small stuff, and then 5 key attributes to create this experience. Go through a couple of those. I wish we had 5 hours for this conversation, but oh
Yeah,
my
it's a
god,
lot to cover. I mean, look, I think, to your point, the one thing that is vitally important, if we just sort of look at, okay, what would my advice be to a business leader? I think at number one, you have to be crystal clear today about what your value is as a business. There's way too much noise. There's way too much product availability and service availability. And there's just too much clutter in the market to not be crystal clear about the value that you're delivering to the consumer. If you can arrive at a place of clarity where you clearly understand what your purpose is in the life of the consumer, everything becomes easier from that point forward. Everything, every decision that you make, whether that's a hiring decision, whether that's a design decision around your products or your stores, every technology choice or investment that you make is going to be much, much more clear if you have that crystal sense of who you are, what you do, who you do it for, and why you do it. What is the purpose that you serve? Where companies run into problems, where they just start chasing every trend that comes along, is where they don't have that clear sense of self. And we see a lot of companies like that today. I would argue that, one that's in the news almost every other week is a company like Macy's. Macy's, I think, has just lost all sense of who they are, what they do, who they do it for, why they do it, and why that matters. And when you're lost like that, what you tend to do is it's like being at a roulette table where you just put one chip on every single number on the table and you're never going to win, right? Every time that the wheel comes to a stop, you've basically lost more than you've won, just by virtue of the math. And that's where a lot of companies find themselves today. So you have to decide what it is that you do, who you do it for, and why that matters. Beyond that, in terms of creating the experience, I sort of look at it as 5 fundamental attributes of every remarkable experience. And if you think about your own experiences in your life, these probably will resonate. Um, I use the acronym SUPER. So every remarkable experience starts with being surprising. Usually something happens that you didn't expect, something somewhat out of the ordinary that catches your attention. The next thing is uniqueness, that it is unique to your brand. There's this ritualistic way that your brand does this that no other brand does. And that can apply to the way you serve food in a restaurant, or it can apply to the apparel experience in your stores. Doesn't matter what the category is. The next thing is personalization, that the consumer feels like something happened that it was just for them, that you tailored this experience to them and them alone. The E is for engaging, that you're engaging the consumer with more than just the product itself, but that you're treating them to sight and sound and taste potentially, and that the atmosphere brings a scent or an aroma with it, that you're engaging all of their senses. And then finally, that the R is repeatable, that the experience is something that you can, even though it feels like it's bespoke for every single consumer, you're able to deliver on that over and over and over again, to the tune of millions of experiences a day. So those are the five key attributes of the quote unquote super experience.
Yeah, I love that. It seems like one of the more challenging ones. If you get the design right and you're the founder and you're as like some of your examples, you're this one location or store and you're there, you can make it happen. The most challenging one that I see is the repeatability piece. It's a lot of work to get the design right for the amazing experience with the first four attributes, but that fifth one, doing it's challenging. And I like the way you framed a question. It was, if your product is the answer, what is the question? And I went right to Amazon. Okay, so the question for me is, I want it to be super easy to find whatever I want. I'm willing to pay a premium and not take a lot of extra time. Just make it easy. Amazon.
Exactly.
So elaborate on that a little bit. I've been testing different companies and asking them, to frame it that way, and they're having a hard time coming up with the answer.
Yeah, and it's a question that I start off with in most consulting engagements. If I bring together a group of executives within a company, that's the first question I'll ask is, "Okay, your brand is the answer. What was the question that got asked?" Right? Um, if I'm saying, if I look at Walmart, I could say with certainty today, if I brought together 100 executives from Walmart and asked that question, they'd all say value, all of them, in a chorus, right? Um, if it were Amazon, it would be, as you said, convenience, maybe selection and convenience. If it was a company like Patagonia, if I said, your brand's the answer, what's the question? The question would be environmental protectionism. They understand themselves perfectly. There's a cohesiveness within the organization as to what their north star is, and that drives every decision. Now, it's not to say that you won't hit speed bumps and things won't come out of left field at you, but when you have that sense of course heading, things are much, much easier to deal with, than if you're just sort of adrift, not knowing what your value is. So yeah, it's a question every single brand should really sit down and try and answer. If your brand is the answer, what is the question that you and you alone are the best answer to in the marketplace?
In my view, every single company and organization and individual has a brand, whether it's
Yeah, whether you like it or not. Yeah.
intentional or not, right?
Yeah.
They have that. And and so how do we leverage that? How do we go forward? And when you say, retail isn't dying, average is.
Right.
And I take that again to every single type of business out there. I think it applies across the board. Am I right in my thinking there or directionally?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say that, in most markets, when we look at most markets today, a lot of what we're looking at is average. It's mediocre. And every year we sort of see more of the wheat coming off the chaff in that respect. We see businesses, I mean, put it this way. If we were to look back at the list of businesses that have gone bankrupt over the last 10 years, how many of those were mourned? How many of them were situations where consumers were going, "Oh my gosh, what am I gonna do now? Now that they're gone," you know? They just disappeared, and they didn't even, without a murmur, you know, because they were average to begin with. The only time that we really bemoan something is when it had some sort of remarkable value to us, whether that was emotional or nostalgic or transactional. But most companies that are going by the wayside today are just part of the herd, just part of the very average, mediocre set of businesses that are out there.
Yeah. And as when they're successful, and I can go back to my history in aviation, sir, it's easy to sit on your hands when everything's going amazing. You don't keep pushing. So when you consult with clients, how do you keep them on that leading edge of continually creating a better experience, more value for their customers? I find it to be a mindset, and it was interesting. I sold one of my businesses for 9 figures almost exactly 10 years ago, and we had a dinner with some of the senior leaders a couple months back, and one of them commented, when I started, he was employee number 17, and that was so early in the ride. He goes, the first year we pushed hard and that was hard. The next year we did the same thing. The third year we did the same thing. And everybody's asking, we do keep doing this? And they realized after 3 years, yes, this is how we roll. And wow, we grew fast and got a higher multiple than anybody else I've ever heard of in our industry for the type of business that we had when I sold it. Keeping it on that leading edge and not getting comfortable. How do you address that to make sure they stay there?
So first of all, from a structural standpoint, it's worth just sort of acknowledging the idea that it's very difficult in large enterprises, in large public enterprises, very difficult to maintain focused organizational energy. When, in a startup, it's easy, right? The founder is on the front lines with all their people. They're very close to the consumer. They understand the market. The founder has a very clear sense of why the business exists and the noble mission, perhaps, that it is on to break the status quo and all of that stuff, right? Apple's a great example of that. When Apple first hit the market, you could feel the energy. I mean, as a consumer, you could feel that anti-establishment energy within Apple because Steve Jobs' energy was very much still permeating every layer of the company, right down to the consumer. Um, as a company grows and scales and the founder themselves gets pulled further and further from the front lines as there layers and layers of administration set up, the whole organization becomes more disconnected from the consumer. Decision making moves away from the front lines and into the administrative tiers of the organization, and a lot of the organizational energy that was dedicated to building great products and amazing services and delivering on consumer promises gets pulled into just keeping the organization sustained day to day, right? And so that is first of all worth acknowledging, and organizations need to make a very concerted effort not to allow that to happen to them, to maintain that energy on the consumer. Number one. Number two, I actually recommend to companies, and people think I'm nuts when I recommend this, but I actually recommend that every company set up almost a separate business within the company that doesn't have the same reporting structure, has its own leadership, has its own budget, and whose only job is to figure out how to put the parent company out of business. That's what they do. Every single day, they wake up to build a business that is so good that it would put the parent business out of business, like a black ops team, right? And they don't get pulled into the day to day. They don't get pulled into the administrative BS. They are waking up basically every morning to be your worst competitor. The bonus is, however, they are working for you, right? Ultimately, they're trying to create the next best model. So you're not just waiting for your competitor to do it and reading about it on the front page of the New York Times. You actually have sort of a skunk works operation inside the company that's actually working to build that. That can be a very effective way of maintaining that innovative edge, having your own team that's working in that direction.
With all the large brands that you've worked with, and it's super impressive, what are a couple of best practices to maintain the innovative, I call it value creation edge, in some of the things that get in the worst practices that get in the way of that?
There's an openness. The best companies that I have worked with have, number one, an openness to new information that others simply don't. Um, Companies that run into innovation problems. I mean, we've all heard this before. It's the company that says the first one of the first things they'll say to you is, "What you need to understand about our industry is," and then it's sort of fill in the blank. But it always starts with what you need to understand about us, right? As opposed to what we need to understand about what's happening, right? And so the companies that I've worked with that are the most innovative, that are the most daring and creative, are the companies that start with we're open to hearing what we need to understand, right? As opposed to just telling you what you need to understand. Um, the other piece is um, companies that are constantly testing new things, um, constantly testing nothing. They don't look at anything really as being the destination, right? It's just a continual journey that everything is in constant iteration and trial and testing and pushing the envelope to see how far they can go. Where many companies just want to try and arrive at a plateau and then, work on that plateau. Um, the best companies are those that are constantly pushing themselves and just receptive to new information, new ways of thinking about things.
Yeah. Yeah, I see it really as a value creation journey, no end to where it can go. And so how do we get comfortable with, every point in time along that journey that we're on?
Well,
100%. Yeah.
yeah, and I think if you feel comfortable, that's part of the problem. If and I was just having this conversation with someone the other day, they were saying it was another consultant, frankly, and they were saying, "What advice would you give me in terms of like what narrative should I be pursuing um, to make a name for myself?" And my thought for them was that if you feel comfortable with the narrative that you're taking to the market, it's probably not the right narrative. And I would say that to any corporation. If you feel like what you're doing is completely comfortable for the organization, then it probably isn't daring enough or risky enough to really break through in a remarkable way. When we look at the things, when you look at the ideas that break through, many of them start off as being completely audacious. I mean, the idea, think about, 20 years ago, if someone would told you that a perfect stranger was going to pull up in an unmarked vehicle and you would get into that car and trust that individual to take you to the place that you wanted to go. And there would be no risk to your safety in doing that. That would have been an absolutely crazy idea at the time, but that's Uber, or that you were going to go and stay in someone's apartment in a foreign city without ever having met them. You were going to be invited to stay in their apartment, and they would trust you to do that, and you would trust them. Audacious. So risky ideas are the things that break through, and you need to have the organizational courage to constantly be putting yourself on that ledge. And it's terrifying. And, investors often won't like it. Your investors don't want you to innovate, they want you to print money. And this is the trap that a lot of large enterprises find themselves in, is that it becomes very difficult to innovate or to do the things you need to do in the business because your investors don't want that risk that comes with innovation.
Yeah. I run into a lot of leaders that, they want it to be easy. They don't want the struggle. And what I'm getting out of what you're saying, and this is something I fully believe, is that to improve, we have to put effort in. If we're going to improve a lot of effort, so a lot of struggle, and to be comfortable with that. Another way of saying be super uncomfortable being uncomfortable, and you've heard a lot of folks say that, but what does it mean practically? It means staying on that leading edge and pushing yourself to be more and more uncomfortable and loving being in that zone. and that's a steady state. And I think it's a really healthy stress. And I think when things are going wrong, I kind of internal mantra: Am I a victim or a developer? If I act like a victim when it goes sideways, that's a complete waste of time. But I can be developing better decisions, better actions, better people, developing them, finding better team members. That is super productive.
Yeah.
And it can be unhealthy. Excuse me. It can be a really big struggle that I would call a healthy struggle. And I love that. And I know when I come out the other side, it's going to be so much better because I've done it over and over and over again for decades now. Does that resonate? Yeah, does
Yeah.
that make sense to you? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's no different than any form of growth, right? If we're even thinking about the way we grow muscles at the gym, it's by breaking down muscle. It's literally by breaking the tissue is what helps you develop more. And I think organizations are exactly the same way. In a responsible uh, uh, in a responsible way, you have to break the paradigms and keep pushing yourself further and further to whether that's to innovate or to just get much better at what you're doing. Deliver more and more value to consumers. There's a tendency, I think, among many companies to come to a point where you the effort to create more value, we've been talking a lot about value, but the effort to create more value is greater than the effort that would be required to simply extract more from the equation, right? And so what we find companies doing, rather than figuring out a way to deliver exponentially more value to the consumers, they find ways to take input costs out. They begin to actually deliver the same thing, but do it more cheaply. And that's a completely different way of thinking. It's a reductive way of thinking as opposed to thinking in a more progressive and additive way. The best companies are constantly adding value to the equation.
I think that's a perfect way to frame it. And as we kind of wrap up, as I go through your stuff and I'm answering questions and thinking about, applying all of your thought leadership, uh, the, the question when it comes to my consulting business, ETW, is how can you more effectively, continually and responsibly increase the value of your business? Well, it's our mind management systems that I've developed over decades, going through. And so that I think is just, super helpful. In framing, our job is to continually create more value. So how do we stay in that zone? And I really love the way you talk
Mhm.
about extracting it. What final thoughts as we wrap paper? What final thoughts for our listeners would you like to share?
I would simply say this. I think if I were giving advice to any company that's listening right now, um, I would say there are a few things that I think you really need to focus on. Number one, in terms of AI, right? It's hard to go 5 minutes today without a conversation about AI. But in terms of AI, I would do two things. I would figure out first and foremost what are the table stakes, right? Eventually, we're going to come down to probably a widely used, widely accepted suite of applications that most enterprises are using. Think kind of Microsoft Office, right? We're all going to be using pretty much the same tools. What will matter is not the technology at that point. What will matter is how we're using the technology, and that's going to come back to the human operating system. So I think now is when we really need to be creating a pipeline to extremely talented people. But what are the skills that they're going to need? Um, what we know is that AI is very good at gathering information that already exists, analyzing that information, and reporting on it in a really cogent way. We're not going to need as many people to do that in our organizations, but we are going to need people who are extremely good at critical thinking, who are really strong in terms of coming to ethical conclusions about information. We're going to need people who are wonderful communicators who can inspire the organization toward new objectives and toward breaking those paradigms that we were talking about. And lastly, we're going to need divergently creative thinkers, people who can look at the promise of AI and what it can do and can use it in extremely creative ways to create new value. So I would say, first and foremost, don't obsess about the tools as much. Determine what your table stakes investments need to be to keep up with what's happening. But eventually, and probably sooner than we might think, there's going to be that kind of universally accepted toolkit that we're all using. The question is, are you going to have the greatest amount of human talent in your category? And I can tell you right now, the education system is not producing the kind of critical thinking, communication skills, or creativity that is going to serve the entire market. So you're going to have to find a way to build a pipeline to that talent and to hoard it. And if you can do that, I guarantee you're going to come out on top.
That's fantastic. I think the purpose of an education is to create value in the world, and there are many paths to it. And one of the ways that I keep doing it, and it should be lifelong, is I get amazing guests every week on my podcast. And this is the best opportunity for me to continually develop. And this has been a real treat having access to you, this conversation, and all the research getting ready for it. So thank you for all you do. If our listeners want to learn more about your work, connect with you, how can they do that, Doug?
Just go to retailprofit.com. That's the mothership.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you again for being here. This was fantastic.
My pleasure, Lee. Thanks for having me.
And this has been the Show Your Value podcast. If you got some value out of today's episode, please like and subscribe. And until next time, show your value to the world.